Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Hello?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Thank you. I'm just hoping that my slideshow is currently up and loaded. I guess I'll just start.
Yes, it is.
Fingers crossed that my slide is up there. Thank you so much. And I'm here to speak in support of the motion in terms of recalibrating the Housing Vancouver strategy post-COVID. And I think that if you hit the next slide, that really what's happened with the Housing Vancouver plan, I think two elements are actually, I think it's a start. That very much there's been, I think, a terms of transparency and terms of accountability, that there has been a release of data that has not been there before in terms of informing the public about what's going on in the environment in terms of housing the city. But I think that similarly, I think that it's a start, and that fundamentally it's building upon this initial start that I think really needs to move forward. And this goes into specific things like how temporary modular housing shouldn't necessarily be just slotted as social housing. And I think that in that name of transparency, that has been sectioned out, but yet at the same time, it's sometimes counted as social housing. And I think it's very clear to come out with very strong definitions of what these various categories are. Next slide, please. And I think that a lot of this is also touching upon really the complete disconnection, as other speakers have talked about, in terms of the disconnection between what's being built and who can afford this versus who actually lives in the city. If you go for this slide that illustrates really the disconnection, or rather disconnection, we find that 66% of what was approved to be built in a year in Vancouver is only really going to be affordable for 40% of its population. And I think that is, highlighting one of the kind of key challenges in terms of this recalibration. Next slide. And I think within this recalibration has actually been the release of more data. You have to remember the Housing Vancouver plan was created in November 2017, and has since there's been a number of major releases in terms of data and research relationships between the federal government and the provincial government. I think all through which create really important sets of information and data sets in terms to incorporate. And I think the first and foremost is the understanding that 46% of the condominiums that were built in Vancouver are actually occupied by non-owners, that their owners don't actually live in that. And I think that is one of the new pieces of information to kind of fit in this entire conversation of what's going on in the Vancouver housing market. And I think that really it's this piece of, I think, new data and new research that I think really has changed since the last 2 years, that you also have to look at existing ones. And of course, the discussion about the future growth of the population really being connected towards immigration really highlights some of the challenges, because we find that immigrants in Vancouver, specifically living in the city of Vancouver, only earn half as much as in terms of a median total income as the non-immigrant population. So I think this entire discussion about how new housing is connected towards housing new immigrants, I think is really, again, one of the major challenges. And really some final comments, and I think that this is really elements through which is really seen in the reports that have come out since the initial 2017 strategy, is really, I think, really clearing up the differences between approvals versus starts and housing completions, and how they're connected, or rather disconnected, in the provision of housing in the city of Vancouver. The discussion of gross versus net numbers, and really, I think, core within this discussion is the loss of affordability in terms of displacement and gentrification, as well as suitability, and that not all demand should necessarily have the same priority in terms of housing, and that housing tenure isn't necessarily the same as affordability, right? That by saying someone is a renter does not necessarily mean that they're living in affordable housing, of course. And that really, for housing in the post-COVID era, we really see that really the issues around biomedical security, adaptability, and flexibility are going to emerge. And that really the core of this is really trying to deal with meeting in the questions of who and where will be as important as how many when we think about housing policy into the future of the city. Thank you.
That was perfectly timed.